All right, so today we're going to talk about ecosystems, and there's actually a pretty good section in your textbook. It's only about 6 pages, but it's pretty good reading. So give that a look. Yeah, so we're skipping over communities one last time, I promise. The next lecture will be on communities. And so just to remember what communities are, they're groups of populations of all the living organisms in one place and one time. And they're interacting in all the various ways that we've talked about, from competition, cooperation, enemy attack. And the reason we're going to skip over it is because community ecology is actually really complex, and so we're going to come back to it after we've thought a little bit about ecosystems, because in some ways ecosystems are simpler, and you'll see why in a minute. Right, and so the definition I gave you of ecosystems was that basically includes communities, so all the communities are a part of the ecosystem, but it brings in the physical environment as well. So the rivers, the rocks, the atmosphere are all considered to be part of an ecosystem. And it's often studied. Another difference between sort of community ecology and ecosystem science is that ecosystem people tend to study much larger scales than community ecologists. And you'll potentially see why in the lab we do this week, that it can often be easier to track the physical processes that are happening at an ecosystem scale at much larger spatial scales than it can be to identify plants in a community. Okay, so that's fine, but I'm guessing this definition is not as useful to you as some of the other ones, right? So we know it's communities and it's physical environment as well, but what does that even mean, right? So to do that, I want to go back to the sort of early days of ecology. So Arthur Tansley, shown here in this awesome mustache and fetching cap, he coined the term ecosystem in 1935, and it actually emerged as a product of some debate around community ecology that we're going to get to in the next lecture, but we don't need to worry about that right now. And to try and resolve the debate, he argued that we needed to start considering the whole system in the sense of physics, and that's his parenthetic statement. Consider the whole system in the sense of physics, including not only the organism complex, but the whole complex of physical factors forming what we call the environment. This was not exactly a clear definition of ecosystem, but it really set the seed for others to think more clearly. And it really was, he literally coined the term in this essay that he had written. And actually, there's a journal, New Phytologist, which is one of the more famous plant biology journals. They have a series of review papers they actually call the Tansley Reviews in memory of Arthur Tansley, who was just a very famous ecologist. So the ecosystem concept eventually arose from the idea of thermodynamics, and that's what Tansley meant by in the sense of physics, right? So we've seen Alfred Ladka before in the context of those Ladka-Volterra equations we used for competition and predation. Ladka was a chemist by training, I think I said that before, but he became interested in biology in the 1920s. And because he was a chemist, he tended to treat populations and communities as if they were thermodynamic systems. And so that's really what led to the concept of this thermodynamic ecosystem. Great. I'm not sure that I'm helping you yet, right? So you might be asking, well, what does that mean? So let's take a slight detour into physics. Thermodynamics is the branch of physics that deals with heat, temperature, and their relation to energy, work, radiation, and the properties of matter. And so that's what we mean when we talk about ecosystems, that we're thinking about energy, work, radiation, and properties of matter. Now, hopefully this is running through your head. I thought this was a botany class. What in the world does physics have to do with botany? But when we go to the ecosystem, it actually turns out to be much more useful to try to think of ecosystem in the context of thermodynamics, right? So you've got radiation that comes into the ecosystem from space. You've got all different kinds of matter that organisms are made up with, but also the physical environment is made up of matter as well, and those different types of matter have different properties, right? Oxygen and water have different properties, but sunflowers and beetles also have different properties, and those properties are important for how we understand the ecosystem. You've got stored energy in the form of carbohydrates and ATP and things like that. Photosynthesis is really just a form of work in the sense of physics, and you could think of digestion or animals walking around or ants building little piles of dirt. All of that is work in the sense of physics. And we haven't talked that much about temperature, but we saw how temperature probably limited jackpine distributions. You could imagine that temperature probably limits photosynthesis in ways that are important for ecosystems, right? Temperature may be critically important for understanding the difference between a tropical and an Arctic ecosystem, for example. So if we go back to our slight detour, right, there are 4 laws of thermodynamics, right? The first law is basically conservation of energy. right? You can transform energy but not destroy it. So when a fox is eating a hare, it's transforming all of the matter and energy of that hare into foxes, the form of matter we know as foxes. Right? Photosynthesis, herbivory, mycorrhizal trade, all that stuff is basically part of the law of conservation of energy. And thinking of it in this way potentially simplifies the way we might understand what's going on in an ecosystem. The second law, systems tend towards homogeneity. In other words, to the lowest entropy, right? So the point there is it keeps work. It takes work to keep an organism alive and to keep a cell from just diffusing apart into its many pieces. The other laws are not as important, right? So the third law is something about absolute zero, which doesn't happen that often in ecosystems. The zeroth law, it's often called, is more or less just the definition of temperature, so we're going to put those aside. But hopefully you're starting to see a glimmer of why thermodynamics is important for thinking about ecosystems with these first two laws of thermodynamics. So basically what Ladka did with his naive interpretation of biology was that he argued that you could think of a feeding system as a system of equations that govern the transformation of organisms that get eaten into organisms that are eating them, right? This is what the Ladka-Volterra predation equations were. The prey literally get converted into the predators. What's interesting about this historically is that as far as we know, Tansley, or as far as I know, Tansley never seems to have referred to Ladka's work, even though it came about 10 years before. And it really would have given the clearest model and way of thinking for his concept of the ecosystem. And I don't think that Ladka was particularly interested in ecosystems, even though his mathematics eventually became an important step towards defining ecosystems. I like this historical trivia, if you can't tell. And unfortunately, the history of ecology is just littered with white men, and I like showing you pictures of them mainly because I feel like it humanizes the ideas, and I apologize that they're all just old white men. Okay, so the next step came from another white dude. Ladka really looked at more than a few species. You could imagine that the mathematics, I showed you those equations. You could imagine that the mathematics become extremely complicated as you go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 100 species. And so the next step occurred in the 1950s where, I think his name was Robert Lindemann. He took these ideas a little bit further, and I think this was his PhD thesis. He developed what was known as the trophic dynamic concept, where he envisioned an ecosystem as a web of feeding relationships that transform energy and matter, right? That first law of thermodynamics. And he imagined that we could simplify the world if we could organize these into what he called trophic levels. And we referred to trophic levels already in our herbivory lecture when we talked about top-down versus bottom-up, right? I think people have this intuitive idea of what a trophic level is. So Lindemann he imagined a food chain. You've probably heard this idea, where it's literally just a vertical chain that involves steps of energy transformation. So you had primary producers. He used this little delta symbol to talk about that. That's the plants, herbivores, carnivores, potentially larger carnivores. It really depends on the amount of energy in the system and the efficiency of transformation, as we'll see, how many levels you can have. He called these trophic levels. And so he drew this picture like this. He studied... Actually, I think he was a student of Hutchinson's, although I don't know if that's true or not. He died incredibly young, and so this is really the only paper he ever published, which is actually this landmark paper. But he studied ponds, right? So he imagined you've got solar radiation coming in to plankton that's being eaten by small invertebrates, maybe being eaten by slightly larger invertebrates, and so on as they move up or down this chain. And that's his idea of trophic levels, and this is actually a picture that he drew. I like how he just says ooze in the middle. So trophic levels describe the levels of energy flow in a very coarse way, right? You could imagine that a really simplifying way of looking at an ecosystem is to imagine that, cool, we're just going to bin everything into these 4 categories, right? Doesn't matter what the plants are, we're going to put them all in one bin. Doesn't matter what the herbivores are, we're going to put them all in one bin. And you can imagine that this is going to simplify the hundreds of thousands of species in the world down to just 4 kinds of things that we need to worry about. Right, so nutrients are consumed by plants, which are consumed by herbivores, which are consumed by predators, which are consumed by bigger predators, right? And we could imagine then that this is how we get those top-down or bottom-up trophic cascades. What's interesting, and we'll see about why in a second, is terrestrial systems rarely go higher than primary predators, and we'll talk about that in a second. Right, but in reality, trophic levels are rarely perfectly clear, right? So detailed feeding relationships that actually define the true flow of energy are often called food webs, and they're considerably more complicated, although now with computing power it's a little bit easier to understand the topology of these feeding networks. The top and bottom are usually distinct, and you could probably imagine why, and I'll show you a picture in a second. But the middle is often a bit messy, right? So part of the reason why the top and bottom are distinct is because, the bottom is invariably something that photosynthesizes, and the top is invariably some kind of specialized predator. And so, you don't get a lot of room to be something in the middle, whereas, these middle things, maybe toads can, well, I'm trying to think of an example here, but you can imagine that maybe spiders can potentially be eating herbivores, and they can potentially be eaten by birds or by toads, and so it becomes a little bit messy who exactly are in the middle layers. Right, and so if we just return back to the central question in ecology, we could ask what controls the distribution and abundance of individuals, where do we find them, how many, what kinds, how many kinds, right? In the context of ecosystems, right, the ecologist is primarily concerned with the quantities of matter and energy that pass through a given ecosystem and the rates with which they do so. So this is the sense in which Tansley meant that we could think about ecosystems in the context of physics. So how does energy and matter move through the ecosystem? That's what I want to talk about next. I think I'm going to wrap this video up here, and we'll answer this question in the next video.